Today's guest is Dr. Bill Schindler. He is an experimental archaeologist, chef, and author on mission to reconnect us with real nutrient dense food so we can reclaim our health and vitality in the modern world. Drawing on cutting edge science and a lifetime of research into ancestral diets, he wrote the book Eat Like a Human, showing how traditional cooking methods can make our food more nourishing, satisfying, and sustainable.
He is the founder of Eat a Human and director of the Eastern Shore Food Lab, where he teaches people how to use old world techniques like fermentation, nose to tail butchering, and sourdough to thrive in today's ultra processed food culture. He also serves as executive chef at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, a family run restaurant that brings these principles to life on the plate. In this conversation, we are going to talk about everything sourdough.
So, if you're new to my channel, I'm Dr. Steve Hewlett. I've been a doctor of pharmacy for 35 years, and I just realized that pills do not fix the real problem with our health. And that problem is our food and our habits. My wife, Teresa, and I now help people lose weight, decrease or eliminate medications, and get their energy back by changing what's on their plate and in their environment, not by living in the gym.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be here and thrilled to talk about sourdough bread. Let me perhaps first explain a little bit about what sourdough bread is and actually where it fits into my life and both personally from a dietary perspective, my family's life, but also from a restaurant perspective from at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen. But let me start with this quick little story. Years ago, I forget how many years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I did a podcast with Paul Saladino. And Paul Saladino, and I knew ahead of time he was going to ask me about bread and sourdough bread in general. And this is when our sourdough bakery that we had that came out of our home we turned it into a commercial bakery, and we're in the midst of turning the bakery into a restaurant like what we have now. So I knew it was going to be a topic. And this was at a time when Paul Saladino was hardcore. I don't think he was even eating fruit at this point. He was still very hardcore from the carnivore world. And he said, all right, what are your thoughts on, and I knew he was going to ask, so I was prepared. But I think it was a great answer. So I want to say the same thing now. He said, all right, tell me about the sourdough bread. What are your thoughts on sourdough bread? Do people need to eat sourdough bread? Absolutely not. There is literally no biological requirement for any grains in the human diet whatsoever. So from a biological perspective, there's no reason to eat bread at all. But for so many of us, bread is a part of our life. And when we as humans, and I say this all the time, and I completely mean this, in order to be fully nourished as a human, it means that we need to meet all of our needs, not just our nutritional needs. We need to meet our cultural needs and our emotional needs and our religious needs, and for some people, our political needs, and all these different things. And to be fully nourished as a human, because food is so intertwined with every single thing that we do, we need to meet the totality of all of those needs. For some people, bread is a part of their life. For many people, bread is a part of their life. Do we need to eat bread? No. But if you're going to eat bread, true, genuine, 100% wild, long fermented sourdough bread is the best option by far. In bread and sourdough bread, conventional bread and sourdough bread shouldn't even have, unfortunately, the same label as bread because they're completely different foods. And I hope over the time that we have together here, I can explain to everybody why and how to make those choices and how to either make it yourself, or if you're not going to make it yourself, at least how to understand, wade through all the nonsense in the grocery store and understand what it is you should buy. So again, we do not need to eat bread to be healthy, but I do believe at the same time, the right kind of bread can be a part of a healthy human diet. And for people that are consuming a massive amount of carbohydrates in the form of bread, and if they simply, as a first step, make the switch from conventional bread to sourdough bread, they're going to see some major changes in their body composition, in their blood work, and then just their overall. For some people, it could be inflammation. It could be all sorts of positive benefits from making that switch. So with that said, what does it mean to be sourdough bread? And this is very important. Every single thing that we talk about over the rest of this interview is based on what I'm going to say right now. Bread has been around, we know archaeologically, for about 8,000 years. The earliest full-blown example of bread dates to, I think it's about 7,800 years ago, was found on a site in Turkey called Katahoyuk. And every single loaf of bread from almost 8,000 years ago, anywhere in the world bread was made, almost 8,000 years ago until the mid 1800s, was by default wild, long fermented sourdough bread. There was no other way to do it. And in the mid 1800s, there were some scientific changes that resulted in creating the bread that most of us have access to today, everywhere in the world. Those breads for 8,000 years were created through a combination of fermentations from yeast and fermentations from bacteria. Yeast and bacteria occur in nature side by side. So if you just provide the opportunity to feed both and put it in the right environment, these colonies of yeast and these colonies of bacteria that are right next to one another. They're on your skin right now. They're on the countertop. They're in the air between us. They're everywhere. They're on the flour. If you provide the opportunity for them to eat and get healthy and strong and produce babies that get healthy and strong and produce babies, they're both going to ferment. They happen side by side. The yeast, when it eats simple sugars or simple carbohydrates, produces two things. It produces carbon dioxide and it produces alcohol. Now it produces, depending if it's an anaerobic or aerobic environment, it produces more of one or the other. But in general, yeast eats simple carbohydrates and produces alcohol and yeast. Now in bread making, we care about the production of carbon dioxide because that's what makes the bread rise. We don't really care about the alcohol production, and it's very minimal anyhow, so we're not even worried about it. If we're talking about beer or wine or something else, it's another conversation. But the yeast, as far as bread making is concerned, does one thing, and all that it does is eat some sugars and produce carbon dioxide, and our bread rises. That's it. The other fermentation that's taking place, I'm simplifying this, it's very complex, but the colonies of bacteria are also eating these simple carbohydrates and producing a whole host of things through that fermentation process, including lactic acid. So that production of lactic acid is creating a more acidic environment. And we'll talk later on about why that's incredibly important. But as the bacteria are consuming these simple carbohydrates, it's producing lactic acid, and that means the pH is dropping. And that's going to be very important later on. So
now, is that only when it's an anaerobic? When it's only anaerobic?
No, it's doing it. It will do it in an anaerobic environment, but even if it has access to oxygen, we're still creating that sort of thing. Okay. There's some nuances here. It's very simplified because, for example, in the production of bread like panettone, there is a period of time where when you're making panettone, traditionally that you're taking the mother, la bicha madre, and putting it in a fully anaerobic environment, and it's creating a few different things. But in general, we're talking about fermentations that are taking place side by side, naturally occurring. All you got to do is provide that environment, and yeast and colonies of bacteria are eating the available sugars, producing carbon dioxide from the yeast and lactic acid from the bacteria. And you're going to be able to create that bread. What changes in the mid 1800s is Louis Pasteur, who in my mind completely destroyed the food system. And he was actually trying, for the beer industry, was trying to figure out how to isolate yeast and just keep yeast going in a lab so that they don't have this complex thing going on that if they're not really careful, they have difficulty controlling it and to produce the same beer all the time. They were just concerned about producing the alcohol. So Louis Pasteur figured out how to take this natural symbiotic relationship of colonies of bacteria and yeast occurring side by side and just pull the yeast out and keep that going in a lab. So that happens in the mid 1800s. And about 3 years later, the Fleischmann brothers figure out how to do that on a larger scale in a factory. And all the Fleischmann's yeast that you see in the grocery store, those little packets, the red and yellow packets, are a result of what was happening in the mid 1800s. From that point forward, it transformed both the alcohol and bakery industries, and almost all the bread around the world from that point forward was made with just yeast without the benefit of the bacteria. And also with beer, all sour beers for over 8,000 years, all beers for over 8,000 years, closer to probably 10,000 years, were sour beers because same thing, it had the same fermentation from the bacteria and the yeast. Now most of them just became a yeasted beverage without the benefit of the bacteria. So that's how we end up where we are today, because it's much easier to take this very controlled, very powerful yeast that's maintained in a lab and in a factory and follow these directions and make this bread look like and feel like the bread that we want. The problem is there's a lot missing without that bacterial fermentation. The bacterial fermentation accomplishes these following things. Number one, it produces lactic acid. We'll talk about why that's important in a second. The fermentations by the bacteria are also responsible for helping to detoxify these grains that we're consuming as humans. We have no biological business consuming these grains, but the fermentation helps alleviate and deal with some of the toxins like the phytates and the lectins and make the overall grain itself safer for our body to consume. Plus, that fermentation also helps because fermentation is a natural biological digestive process. It helps release some of the nutrients there to make our bodies work less hard to access it. It also is responsible for the texture, flavor, and aroma of the bread. All the important things because of the bacteria, and it's missing with our breads now. Real quick about the pH, and then I promise I'll shut up for a few minutes.
No. We want you to talk.
This is the part where if you are a sourdough baker, even an accomplished sourdough baker, please pay attention to this part because it is, in my mind, the missing key between a loaf of sourdough bread that looks and tastes like sourdough bread, but doesn't really do a lot for us from a health or safety perspective, and a loaf of sourdough bread that is genuinely the kind of thing that I have absolutely no problem putting into my body. When flour is just slightly acidic from a pH, so pH of 7 is neutral. So we're talking about like 6.8 or so, but let's say flour is generally fairly neutral. When that lactic acid is getting produced through that bacterial fermentation, the pH is dropping because it's getting more acidic, right? So we're dropping through, taking it from almost close to 7 down lower and lower. And as that pH is dropping, not only is it potentially getting a little bit more sour from a flavor, but we'll talk about that in a second, it's getting safer. We know that there's a threshold when we start getting down into about 5.2 or so, things get really safe. We start getting into a place where microorganisms that could be potentially harmful to humans start to die off. And the lower we go, the more hostile that environment is to pathogenic microorganisms. And we start getting down to 4.6, just about everything can't survive that's bad, except for botulism. We get down to 4.2, and even botulism can't survive there. And now we're getting into a place where all the bacteria that are good for our guts can thrive. So the good stuff is, so we actually, because of that fermentation, we're getting into a very safe place where bad things can start to die off and good things flourish. Now, same thing with vegetables. So we have to, here by law at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, get to below 4.2 on our fermented vegetables because the state knows that nothing bad is going to survive below 4.2. We usually get to about 3.9. So we're getting down into a very safe range. But more importantly for the bread, because even if there was something a little bit off in the dough, we're going to bake it anyhow and kill it off. So that's not the kind of safety I'm talking about here. That kind of safety is very important, but the kind of safety I'm talking about are things like making sure the phytates and the lectins are not going to destroy my gut, or the gluten, if I have a gluten sensitivity. What can I do with the gluten? Because we haven't even talked about the gluten yet. When you get down to a pH of 4.6, this is the most important thing that people in the sourdough world are not talking about. If you get down to below 4.6, there's an enzyme, a protease enzyme that gets activated. And that protease enzyme starts working on the proteins and chopping them up and turning them into the individual amino acids. The major protein we're talking about here is gluten. And the people who are gluten intolerant or gluten insensitive or even celiac can't handle the protein gluten, but they don't have problems with the individual amino acids. So as this enzyme is activated and it starts chopping up the gluten, it starts turning them into their individual amino acids. So the actual content of gluten itself is dropping because it's literally falling apart into individual amino acids.
And that happens around pH of 5.2?
5.6. I'm sorry, 4.6. When it gets below 4.6, it's activated. The longer it stays below 4.6, the more that process happens. And when it plummets, it happens even further. So here, our definition of, a normal definition of sourdough from a sourdough baker would be, yes, we have bacteria and yeast that are both fermenting at the same time. That's great. But I would love to see the world take another step. The step that we take here at the Modern Stone Age Kitchen is to ensure that every bit of flour in anything that we have at some point gets below 4.6. to maximize the health and safety benefits of that process. If it never reaches 4.6, if you have a gluten intolerance, it might as well be eating yeasted bread, just plain yeasted bread, because it hasn't changed. So we have pH meter readings. The bakery downstairs, they're sending me readings all the time at different times. A pH meter is a great way to not only track the pH of it, but also to really nail down your sourdough bread baking. They used to be prohibitively expensive. You can get one off Amazon for $40 now. We use a Yin Mech, it's $41, but you put it in there and it tells you what the pH is. So we make sure every bit of flour in a recipe gets below 4.6, at least at some point in the process before it gets cooked or baked. So with that said, let me just reiterate again very quickly. The sourdough process is taking advantage of a natural symbiotic relationship between bacteria and yeast, which occurs side by side in nature when we put it in the right environment. And this environment is a warm, moist environment with available sugars. They start eating, they start getting very strong, they start having a ton of babies. Those babies get strong and have more babies. Their populations are rising. You have this powerful communities of bacteria and yeast. And during this entire process, the yeast is producing carbon dioxide and a little bit of alcohol. But again, we're not worried about the alcohol in this conversation. And the bacterial fermentation is helping to mitigate the impacts of the toxins and anti-nutrients like lectins and phytates. It's creating lactic acid. Lactic acid is dropping the pH, lower pH gets. It starts activating enzymes. It starts working on the gluten and destroying the gluten. And on top of all of that, because you have these two communities engage in fermentation and having babies and getting strong, they need fuel in order to perform those jobs. And the fuel are the carbohydrates from the bread itself. So the final product itself is much lower in available carbohydrates to the human body than the bread would have been without those fermentations. So you are literally dropping on a glycemic index all the way from something that's in the high range. All yeasted breads, the average of all yeasted breads falls in the high range, and it's about 71. And if we take the same exact ingredients and do nothing else but put it through the sourdough process, it drops out of the high range, through the middle range, down into the low range, and the average is about 54. So by doing nothing else except for making it sourdough, your available carbohydrates have been really eliminated.
That makes sense. And for everybody listening also, whenever it says carbohydrates, you can just interchange that with glucose. It's the same thing. So they're actually eating the glucose. And that's why this is so much better, like you said, with all these people who have all these other GI issues and even diabetes. If you have diabetes, and that's how you get diabetes, because you eat too much glucose. But just switching from the store-bought Franken bread that's not even bread, and Bill will explain that too. The difference between your store-bought bread and the modern Stone Age kitchen type sourdough bread. So that's why diabetics, if you really love your bread, which like Bill said, a lot of people really love the bread, they don't want to give that up. This is the way to go, because now you've decreased the amount of glucose that you're eating. And again, that's the only way you become diabetic, is because you eat too much glucose. So this would be a great option for you.
This is like, in a perfect world, if somebody out there is battling diabetes and they could tomorrow stop consuming bread, fantastic. But the reality for so many of us, and I've been there, I haven't battled diabetes, but I've battled a lot of issues with weight and all sorts of metabolic issues because of food. I'm coming from a place of understanding here. If the reality is, yes, I understand this, and I'm going to take all the bread out of my diet, and you take all the bread out of your diet for a week, and then that's as far as you go, and you can't handle it anymore, and then you're eating more carbohydrates than you ever did before, that's worse than doing nothing. But if you can make that switch and say, hey, I'm going to replace the bread that I'm eating with sourdough bread as a first step. If it's real, genuine sourdough bread, that is an amazing and very powerful but easy step to take. And here's the really cool thing. It tastes better. You're not suffering. When you start eating sourdough bread, genuine sourdough bread made properly, I promise you are going to enjoy it better than the junk that you've been eating at a restaurant or at a grocery store, because it is a real, genuine food that offers safety and nutrition, and your senses have been hardwired through millions of years of evolution to take in the food that is the safest and most nourishing. That's a reality. So It's not like I'm asking you to say, oh, this is going to really suck and you got to wade through it. I'm telling you, you can eat something that you're going to derive more pleasure from and get healthier by doing it. But the reality, it has to be real, genuine sourdough bread.
So explain the real sourdough.
Okay.
Just super simple. Go to the grocery store. Oh, there's a loaf of sourdough bread.
First thing, don't go to the grocery store.
Well, there's two options with sourdough bread. One option is make it yourself, because it really is genuinely that easy. I do at least 2 sourdough bread classes a month here in person, and we have a bunch of online classes, and I've taught thousands of people how to make sourdough bread. And I'm telling you, it really is genuinely that easy to do. But I understand that some people don't have the time or even the desire to start making sourdough bread. So your second best option for sourdough bread is to go somewhere that you trust. Go somewhere where you can either talk to the baker, or you're one person between you and the person that made that bread. And that's a safe food system. That is an informative food system. That's an empowering food system. Almost all of the sourdough bread, things that are labeled sourdough bread at the grocery store or at a restaurant, and I don't care how good the restaurant is, almost all of it is not sourdough bread. And this is, but although we can talk about it, there are some, but I'll tell you some things to look for. But first, let me tell you where the modern industrial food system has started intentionally to try to fool the consumer. One of the issues that we battle here with people coming in, there's a lot of people that come to eat with us because they've either seen us online or heard a talk or a podcast or something, and they're coming here because they know the kind of food that we are making here and they want that food. But we do get people that just come in because we have a storefront and people see us and it's a restaurant, and they come in and have no idea what we're about, and they come in and they start asking about the bread, and we're like, yes, it's sourdough. How about, what's that? And I'm like, that's sourdough. Everything we have, everything that has flour in it here is 100% sourdough. Like, oh, I don't like sourdough. Have you ever had sourdough? No, but I don't like anything sour. The sourdough bakers hate the word sourdough because our doesn't have to taste sour. We can make it taste sour. Some people like sourdough, but it doesn't have to taste sour. And if it's really sour, we've actually done something wrong. But there's the public perception that sourdough bread is supposed to taste sour. So the modern industrial food system understands this very well, and they're giving the consumer what they're expecting. What they do in almost all cases is they take a regular, cheap, yeasted bread and add something that tastes sour to it to give the customer what they expect. And then it's usually in the form of lactic acid, citric acid, or acetic acid, which is vinegar. And so if you take, and what they do is they put that in, bake the bread, instead of putting it in the really glitzy plastic bag, they put it in a paper bag and then stick it not in the bread aisle, but over by the deli section. And they slap a more expensive label on it and they say, here's your sourdough bread. But it's not. It's no better than the Wonder Bread that it should be sitting next to. If you take a loaf of something that says sourdough and turn it over, sourdough bread requires 3 ingredients: flour, water, salt. That's it. That is it. And trillions of wild bacteria and yeast that have been populated there because of the water and the flour mixture, right? So sometimes sourdough bread will say flour, water, salt. Sometimes sourdough bread will say flour, water, salt, and either mother or live cultures or active bacteria or something like that. That's genuine sourdough bread. If it says anything acidic, citric acid, lactic acid, acetic acid, or vinegar, which is the same thing, then I can guarantee you that it is not sourdough bread. They're just trying to make the bread taste a little bit sour, so when you eat it, you think you're eating sourdough bread. That is, if you want to buy it, go ahead and buy it, but you're wasting your money because you can buy a cheaper version of it in the regular bread aisle. Sometimes it's going to say yeast on it. Now, because we already had the conversation about what sourdough bread really means and the fact that it's a bacterial and yeast fermentation happening side by side, and again, if we can deal with it, if you're making it yourself, get below that 4.6 pH at some point. You're never going to know that on a package label. But we know what genuine sourdough bread is. If it's got something acidic in it, it's almost 100% fake, and it's not real sourdough. If it has yeast in it, it's a red flag, but it still could be sourdough. And let me tell you why. A lot of sourdough bakers, especially on an industrial scale, will add, we don't do it here, but some will actually do real genuine sourdough and add a little bit of yeast in, because the yeast that's coming out of the factory is more predictable and more powerful than some of, somebody's sourdough culture that's sitting somewhere else. So in order to make maybe the bread rise a little bit more, or to be a little bit more predictable, especially if they're not paying really close attention to it, sometimes they'll add a little bit of yeast in. If it's real, genuine sourdough bread and they've added a little bit of yeast into it, you still could attain the same health benefits if they're doing all those things. But the reality is most people adding yeast are not making sourdough bread. It's actually not sourdough bread. So if it says something sour, it's not sourdough bread. If it says yeast in it, I would be pretty confident that it's not sourdough bread, but it still could be. And that right away gets rid of about 90% of anything you'd buy on a commercial scale. And I've seen the bread that restaurants have access to. We have the same purveyors coming in here trying to sell us their food. I've seen all the catalogs. I've seen the ingredients. The sourdough bread coming from like a Cisco truck and it says sourdough bread is suffering from the same issues as the other ones. So if you go to a restaurant and it says, hey, you're going to get your hamburger and it says, I got sourdough buns there, again, 90% of the chance that it is not real sourdough bread.
And then with the yeast, another reason they do that is also so they don't have to ferment it as long.
Absolutely. Right? It's a heck of a lot faster. It's easier to control. And I hesitated when I started to say that a minute ago about the control piece, because the process, when you make sourdough bread, you are babysitting trillions of wild bacteria and yeast. You literally, if you know what you're doing, it is very controllable. You can produce the same bread, but you have to be skilled and you have to understand what you're doing. And so I'm not suggesting that it's not controllable, but on an industrial scale, adding or using straight commercial yeast that is the same strain all the time, everything's exactly the same, you pour it in or what, and it's much easier to do on that scale, and it's faster. Both of those things save people a lot of money.
Yeah. One real quick question, then we'll go on because you have other. Just like you keep talking about once you get the pH down, but the pH of the stomach is going to be around 1 or 2. Does that not have any effect on the bacteria, the yeast, or the process in any way? Do you know the difference between the pH of the stomach or after you eat it versus while it's being made? Is there a difference in how it breaks down the gluten and all these other things that people have?
I don't know from a bread perspective what the pH going into your mouth compared to the pH of your stomach, if that's impacting any of those things at all. I do not know. Yeah. But I do know this. A couple things that I think are really big takeaways. Number one, we have, and some people in the medical community are going to say that I'm lying. This is not a lie. It's 100% true. And if I said it 3 years ago, I think everybody in the medical community would say that I'm lying. But right now, we're starting to become aware of real sourdough. But we have that I know of, 11 medically diagnosed celiac customers that are absolutely fine on our bread. I'm not talking about gluten. We have scores of gluten intolerant customers that are fine on our bread, but we have 11 medically diagnosed celiac customers that are absolutely fine on our bread. Now, with that said, we have a few celiac customers that are not fine on our bread. Like everything else, it's a spectrum, but 11, because of the way that we're handling our bread. If they ate the fake version of the sourdough, they'd be suffering from it. But this, and I'm not even suggesting that we're the only sourdough bakery in the country doing it. There's a ton of amazing sourdough bakeries, but that real genuine sourdough bread can make such an impact on somebody's life, even if they're celiac, which I think is really important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Absolutely. Good. So while we're talking about those ingredients that's in a store, I took a picture. I was at Costco. And I'd heard somebody online, there's a guy that talks about Costco foods. He showing the sourdough bread, and this is the ingredients. Now, of course, we don't know the pH it got to, but it's organic, unbleached wheat flour, water, sea salt, and organic barley malt. So that's one more ingredient.
You see, you just made a liar out of me. That is, chances of that being real sourdough bread are very high. And I'm, again, hesitant to say that because almost every bit of bread that you can get at BJ's or Costco or any grocery store is not going to be, but there are some. And that one probably is. The barley malt, the reason people the bakers add malt or malt extract into their bread is because that creates some very available sugars that help it brown as part of the Maillard reaction during the baking process. So it will positively impact the appearance of that bread in the baking. So that's the reason that's added. There's nothing on that label that gives me pause to think that it's not sourdough.
That's exciting.
But if they put the malt in there for the sugars to do the browning effect, isn't that adding the sugars back? So now it makes it where it's not as good as sourdough by having that barley malt.
Probably it's most likely a very minimal amount. And what I don't know, because we don't add the malt extract, I do know that there's a lot of different types of sugars, right? You have fructose and glucose and all the different things. Some are available as food for the yeast and bacteria, and some are not. What I don't know is, I would imagine that we don't put malt extract in.
Right.
The sugars there might not be available, so they're still there at the end for the baking, and that, yes, they would still be there as well. One thing we didn't mention as far as a full benefit as well, and we started to talk about it, is the idea that this glycemic index is dropping. So your blood sugar response to eating sourdough bread is going to be minimized compared to what it would be from a regular yeasted loaf of bread. And the reason is because you have both the yeast and the bacteria eating those sugars throughout the entire fermentation process. And the fermentation process is usually a lot longer during sourdough bread production than it is during just a yeasted bread production. So that means you have a longer period of time and more microorganisms in the trillions that are consuming these available sugars. But what's also happening through the process of bread making, there are chemical reactions taking place that take the complex carbohydrates, which yeast and bacteria can't eat, it's not available to them, and breaking them down into available sugars. And then the bacteria and yeast are eating those available sugars. So this whole complex chemical and biological process that's happening through traditional bread baking is you have all these carbohydrates in the bread. And then the process is taking the complex carbohydrates, turning them into available sugars, then the yeast and the bacteria eating those available sugars. And this entire time, that glycemic index is dropping and dropping. So by the time that you eat it, the available sugars to the human body are minimized, plus the complex carbohydrates, which human can't derive any nutrition from. We break it down. We have an enzyme in our saliva called amylase that starts converting complex carbohydrates into available sugars. Then we can eat those sugars. Even those complex carbohydrates are lower because they've been converted. Many of them have already been converted and consumed. So we go from, again, an average of 71 from a yeasted bread on a glycemic index from 0 to 100, 71 down to an average of 54 just through the sourdough process. And then if you take that bread, cool it down, and freeze it, you can convert some of the carbohydrates in that to what we call resistant starch, which means it's resistant to the body being able to access it as for calories, for carbohydrates. And you drop it up to another 30% by freezing it for up to 3 days. We see the maximum conversion of carbohydrates to non-available starches in 3 days. So you can freeze it for months and months, but you're not going to see any benefits beyond 3 days. So if you are truly trying to continue to consume bread in your diet, and one of the things that you're concerned about is the glycemic index of that bread, then make sure that it's sourdough bread, freeze it for 3 days or longer, and then consume it. And you've dropped it from about 71 down to 50, down to about something in the 30s or 40s, which is remarkable.
Yeah.
Plus, the resistant starch acts as prebiotics to feed the probiotics in your gut. It is a win-win, and you also get improved flavor and texture and aroma and the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does this only work right after you make it, or if you go to the store and you find some bread like this that may actually be true sourdough, bring it home and then put it in the freezer, it does the same thing, and just keep it in there for at least 3 days, 3 days or longer? Is that true or not true?
I do not know that answer.
Okay.
But I do know that the studies that I've seen say bake it, cool it down, and then freeze it. Can't imagine a world, although I do not know, where the time that it's been cooled down for makes a huge impact on it. So my thought would be freezing it at any time would create an improvement.
Right.
And here's a couple of little hacks if that's the route you want to go. Number one, if you're either buying the sourdough or making it yourself, fully cool it down and then slice it and then put it in the freezer. especially if you live by yourself or just you and a partner, your ability to consume an entire loaf of sourdough bread in one sitting is hopefully negligible. You don't want to get this gorgeous, spend all this time making this gorgeous loaf of sourdough bread, or spend all the money, buy this beautiful loaf of sourdough bread, freeze it, and then have to thaw the entire thing out and then make it whatever. So number one, if you slice it when it's fully cool, when you take sourdough bread out of the oven, where the moisture is in that bread is not where it's going to end up being after the next several hours during the time that bread is cooling. The moisture is moving around quite a bit and it settles out into different places. Plus, it is going to gum up a slicer or gum up your knife if you try to slice it right away. So make sure it's fully cool, slice it, put it in a bag and put it in the freezer. And that way, you want to slice of toast, you just reach in and grab that slice of toast out and put it in the toaster and you're good to go. For our kids, for years, because we've made all their bread for the past 20 years, for school lunches, we'd make sourdough bread, we'd slice it, put it in the freezer, and the night before I would pull out their bread, make the sandwiches right on the frozen bread, put it in their lunch boxes, put it in the fridge, and by the time they ate it, it was fully thawed and ready to go. It's super simple. The other possibility is this, and like I said, we do a lot of sourdough bread classes, and the average KitchenAid mixer somebody has in their home is big enough to make 2 loaves worth of dough at a time. And I always suggest if you're going to spend the time to make sourdough bread, at least make 2 loaves at a time, because it's silly just to do it for one. So make your 2 loaves and then take one of the loaves and bake it all the way through. And that's the bread you're going to eat or cool and slice, whatever you're going to do with it. The other loaf, you par bake it. And when I say par bake it, I mean you bake it to just about 10, 12 minutes or so before it's done. And if you bake it that long, then the inside is cooked. The outside is set up, but it's not like fully browned, right? It's there, but it's not raw, but it's not fully baked with this really hard brown crust on it. So par bake it, pull it out of the oven, let it fully cool, and then wrap it up and put it in the freezer. And that par baked loaf of bread, the next week, you're going to have friends over, you're going to have a dinner, whatever it is, and you don't want to spend the time to make a fresh loaf of sourdough bread, but you really would love to have a fresh loaf of sourdough bread. Pull out that par baked loaf, keep it frozen, go directly into a nice hot oven, 150 degrees or so for about 10, 15 minutes. And what's going to happen over that 10 to 15 minutes, even with it frozen, is the inside is going to thaw out and warm, and the outside is going to finally finish the formation and color of that crust. Then you're going to pull it out, and it is the closest thing to a freshly baked loaf of bread. But in both of those cases, you've done everything you could to minimize that glycemic index. You've baked the bread, you've cooled the bread, first of all, you've made sourdough bread, you've baked it, cooled it, frozen it, reduced that glycemic index, and all of a sudden now you're enjoying bread that has a completely different blood sugar response than something else.
Yep.
So I'm going to ask a question, but I know this is something I have, and I know other people will, but when I was reading that label, so let's say it is sourdough, like you're saying, that the one that's from Costco, but it says 25 grams of carbs in one slice. So how does that measure is what you're talking about? Or is it like, just don't even worry about that? That's just the label. And because people will ask, it's like,
because 25 grams of carbs in one slice seems like a lot of glucose.
It does. And I do not know. I don't know that answer. I'm sorry.
So if they're going to be eating sourdough bread, they should be eating it for these healthier reasons and because they don't want to give it up.
Absolutely.
Right.
And one thing, and I don't know how you guys are going to react to this, because I know because I know I have stopped. I know this is still very important for many people who are dealing with specific issues. I have stopped, and it's been incredibly healthy for me, counting calories and micronutrients at the level that I would even know that a slice of bread would have 25 grams of carbohydrate.
We don't ever count calories or anything like that either.
I just know people ask us.
Yeah.
It's got 25 carbs. So that's why I was curious. But we know it's like it's the quality of what you're eating is what you're really wanting to look at.
The other thing, and I know we talked earlier about this, and this is the study I want to do. And I'll tell you in a second what set me up for this. But what I want to do is I want to put a CGM on, and from a fast or overnight fast, wake up and I'll use the same recipe and I'll make yeasted bread. Yeasted bread.
Oh.
Eat a certain weighed portion of that. and then watch what happens. The next day, from the same state, I have made sourdough bread from that same recipe, but it's been through the sourdough process. And I eat that and see what happens. Same measured amount. Then the next day, do the same thing, but it's been frozen.
Yeah.
And then the next day, eat that, but with fat.
Okay.
Like butter or something like that. And I really want to see what the difference is in my blood sugar response to it. But here's what happened that made me even start to think about that. About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I was teaching a sourdough. So we do sourdough bread classes, but we do some sourdough mother classes too. So it's like the gateway drug for people who aren't ready to make bread yet, but realize sourdough is something they want to play with. So we do a sourdough mother class where people come actually, and for Mother's Day weekend, we do and making them or something, taking care of your mother class. The first day, second day. But anyhow, this class is about how to start a mother from scratch, how to maintain a mother, and all the things you can do with a sourdough mother culture other than making bread, like cookies and crackers and that sort of thing, right? So waffles. So I was teaching this class. It was a Saturday morning. I had just finished. I was carnivore for a full 30 days, maybe just over 30 days up to that point, and I had been wearing a CGM the entire time. So this is the setup for what happened in the class that day. So we were making some sourdough waffles in the class, and we were actually making them and eating them. Or they were eating them, and they said to me, "Hey, and these are like serious big, that big Belgian waffles." Like,
it's the only way to have one.
And we're like, why don't you have one? I'm good. I've been carnivore for 30 days. No, I'm not eating a Belgian waffle right now. No, you talk about the benefits of sourdough. I said, you know what? I'm wearing the CGM. I'm going to do it. So I ate, and I will tell you our sourdough waffles and our sourdough pancakes, we ferment every bit of flour in that recipe for a full 24 hours, and we drop it down to a pH of 3.8. Gluten is completely destroyed. We do it actually for a texture reason, for a health benefit. It's like one of the healthiest sourdough things you can have. So I eat this big Belgian waffle, and we're all watching. My blood sugar goes like this, a little bit up, a little bit down. Exactly what it was beautiful. Huh. So that was at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. So then we go to the class. The class is hours and hours long. Then I'm cleaning up for a couple hours, and then now it's 4:30 in the afternoon. The only thing I've eaten the entire day is this waffle. And my wife, Christina, and our youngest daughter, Alyssa, was here. And we're like, come on, we got to go to Easton. We live in a pretty rural area here. So anytime we get out beyond the 45-minute radius, like we're doing some shopping and things too. So if we got to go to Easton to do whatever. So we go to Easton, and I'm actually pretty hungry at this point. And there was nothing really to eat where we were. We were like at Target and a bunch of other places. And our youngest daughter, Alyssa, loves, what's it called? Playa bowls. You know what Playa bowls is? No. It's kind of like one of these acai bowl places.
Oh, yeah.
So if you asked anybody in this town what the healthiest restaurant is, they probably would all say, oh, the Playa Bowls place. It's not, but that's what they would say. So we go, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm not eating anything here, but I was that hungry. So we go into the Playa Bowls, and we're looking around, and they have a big board with 50 different things on it. It's one of these acai like bowls. And I remember I'm looking. I'm like, I got to eat something, so I'm going to get the healthiest thing I could have. And I find the healthiest one, what I considered the healthiest one of a place that wasn't healthy whatsoever. So I eat this bowl. I spiked to almost 300 on the CG from that bowl.
Oh, wow.
Oh, my gosh.
It was unbelievable. Now, I'm saying that because this sort of discrepancy of I'm eating what many people would consider a junk food, a Belgian waffle in the morning. And because of the way that it's made, you almost couldn't even detect that I ate it. And then later in that day, I'm at a place where most of the general public would consider it to be one of the healthiest places there. And I'm like almost on my deathbed. It's really interesting. But the power of traditional processing of food, especially grains, is really interesting.
That's another question that we get a lot. Does it matter what kind of grain do you use? Does it matter what kind of grain? And do you mill your own grain? Is that a thing, or do you buy it already milled, or how's that work?
We mill our own grain for experiments right now, but we do not have a mill, although we should. This time next year, we will be milling our own grains. I'm confident. Not for all of our bread, but for some. We don't mill our own grains right now. What we do, however, is we have completely changed to 100% organic flour. And it was a very important, everything we do here is not organic. And it's a very intentional decision for several very important reasons. One is As the organic label has been completely bastardized. And some people, they hear organic and think it's healthy, but it's not necessarily healthy. But also, we really do want to support our community and farmers. And there's a lot of farmers and food producers in this community that are doing amazing things with their land and with their plants and with their animals that are not organic. Whether they've chosen not to do it, they're not through the certification process yet, or there's a number of different reasons. So if we went completely organic with some of those things, we would be excluding a lot of people that we really want to support that are fantastic. Plus, and again, they're doing great things. They're just not falling neatly into that label. But with flour, it's different. Flour is so bastardized in this country that you have to go organic. It is one of the very first steps you should take, because we not only the flour that's not organic is sprayed in with all these nasty things, obviously, but the other problem is the fortification of those flours. So by law, the non-organic flour have to be fortified with all sorts of things. And some of those fortifications, like the folic acid, are things that are very problematic. So we made that decision, and it was a very not difficult decision, but it was a very intentional decision, because we overnight tripled the cost of our flour. Cost of our flour. We went from, actually more than tripled, 50-pound bag of the bread flour that we were using was $20, $22, $23, something like that. The flour that we're using now is $77 for the same amount.
Wow.
And what we have to, we can't stand by and not. Now, when we started the business, nobody would have bought the bread. We wouldn't be in business anymore if we started with that right now, because nobody knew who we were and we hadn't built that community yet. And we all of a sudden were trying to sell $12 loaves of bread, and like, what are you talking about? But we've gotten to a place now that people understand the benefits of the approaches that we're taking to our food, not only where they're being sourced, but how the ingredients being sourced, but how we're processing that food and turning it into something that's safer and more nourishing. We were so nervous to boost the price of our bread to reflect the changes in the flour. Not one customer said one word. Really? Nobody batted an eye. I say that because the number one thing I think somebody should do is make sure you're using organic flour. I don't put full faith in the organic label for everything, but for flour, it's incredibly important. Secondly, the sourdough process with it too. But I will tell you, there's several different things that you can do to grains to help detoxify them and make them safer. A long, wild fermentation that includes that bacterial fermentation is amazing. Sprouting is another great thing too, because one of the things about sprouting grains is that the toxins on the outside of the grains are there for a reason. I don't mean the toxins that are sprayed by the farmers, not the toxins that are there naturally as a protective mechanism by the plants. They are trying to protect their babies. They're putting everything they can into protecting the next generation. And they're really powerful things. And those lectins and the things that wreak havoc on our guts are purposefully there to not only protect that grain, but also make sure it stays dormant until it's in the right environment to sprout. Because if that grain sprouts in the wrong environment, then it's definitely going to die. There's no chance of it surviving to then produce viable offspring, right? But what happens is those things are helping keep it dormant. And that grain will not sprout until a lot of those toxins, the issues of those toxins, have been mitigated. So one example is phytic acid, which we talk about all the time. Phytic acid is there to protect that grain and also keep it dormant. But when it's in the right environment, that phytic acid converts to phosphorus, the grain sprouts, and then that phosphorus feeds that growing embryo. It's a beautiful process. So the act of sprouting also is a great way to take something that our body has no business consuming and turning it into something that's safer for us. So in my mind, the absolutely best, safest, most nourishing sourdough bread would come from flour that came from sprouted grains that is then put through the sourdough process.
Now, then do you grind the sprouts and everything? How's that work?
Oh yeah. So if you're making sourdough bread at home and milling your own grains, you can easily do this yourself, because sprouted flour is prohibitively expensive, but it's great stuff. If you sprout those grains just so they sprout, you don't need to sit there and get like a 2 centimeter, like literally, if it's sprouting, a lot of those toxins have been disabled, right? The fact that it even got to that point to sprout them, dry them, grind them, and then you have sprouted flour and then go through the process. It's great. Now, it's a huge lift, but there's a lot of benefits to doing that.
Now, do you always use wheat, or do you use almond flour, wheat flour, all these other types of flours, or what kind do you use?
A bunch of different kinds. So we do use wheat flour, but then we use a lot of ancient grains as well. Spelt is a fantastic flour, but which goes by several different names, is a great flour as well. One thing I would also say is no matter what kind of grain you're using, whether it's a gluten-containing grain or not, it should go through the sourdough process, because remember, the sourdough process isn't just helping with the gluten, but it's also helping to detoxify. And all the grains, whether they contain gluten or not, have those other issues as well. So all of our gluten-free sourdough bread, or all of our gluten-free products are also sourdough. And they go through the full sourdough process. So if you were like, listen, I can't do gluten, I'm not even going to play with the gluten, the sourdough, it's too much for me. I want something that's like bread, but I'm not going to have any gluten in my diet at all. I completely understand that. But what I'm telling you is, if you're baking bread with gluten-free flours, then you still should be putting it through the sourdough process.
Okay.
Makes sense. Are there any questions that you tend to get that we haven't asked? It's a real common question that people tend to ask you.
I'll say one other thing, and then after that I'll explain, and then I got to run because we're moving all the stuff for the tent outside. The tent collapsed and we're trying to get ready for it.
That's right.
I think we've covered most of the bread piece, and if you look at most sourdough bread recipes, not sourdough bread in the grocery store, but most sourdough bread recipes, you are usually getting something that's genuine, right? Most sourdough bread books and most sourdough bread recipes are putting it through the process the right way. The problem occurs when we start getting into other sourdough products, like sourdough cookies and sourdough this and sourdough that. And I'll handle this one really quickly, but I think anybody who's listened up to this point can understand what I'm saying very easily. If you Google sourdough cookies, most recipes that are going to come back are going to be like a Nestle Toll House chocolate chip cookie recipe that has a little bit of sourdough mother in it. That's useless. That is not a sourdough product. So what they do is they take that regular recipe and they add a little bit of sourdough mother in it, which is fine. But then they mix up the cookies, put them on a tray, and put them in the oven and bake them. They have added 2 cups of flour that has never gone through the fermentation process. Just because you added sourdough mother doesn't mean it's sourdough. It never had an opportunity to ferment. The pH has not dropped. None of those things have happened. So no matter what you're making, and look at these recipes, very good, you need to make sure you give it the time, all the flour in the recipe, to ferment, to even give it the opportunity to be safer and more nourishing. But if you don't do that, it's not going to happen. And the other thing that's, again, really important with this too, is these bacteria that are responsible for sourdough bread do not work in a refrigerator. That temperature is too low for them to operate. So if you see the recipe that says, okay, this is a sourdough cookie recipe, and again, it's 2 cups of flour, a little bit of sourdough mother, mix it up, make your cookies and put them on the cookie tray, but put them in the fridge overnight to cold ferment. It's not a thing. The yeast slows down in the refrigerator. Those bacteria shut down. The only thing you've done by putting that cookie dough in the refrigerator overnight is made cold cookies.
Yeah.
They're not sourdough. That's it. So you need, the general thumb is, if you give most things about 3 hours at room temperature, after you've mixed it up and added the sourdough mother and all that, you've most of the time given it enough to be able to.
That is good information.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So now, just real quick, you tell everybody what you can do about your classes, about Modern Stone Age Kitchen, about what your book.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So my family and I have a restaurant called the Modern Stone Age Kitchen, and it is a full service restaurant. We make everything 100% from scratch using traditional approaches to ensure that it's as safe and nourishing as it can possibly be. And it's not crazy stuff. Our goal is to transform familiar foods and make them as safe and nourishing as they can be. So you can come here and eat with us. Upstairs, where I'm coming to you from here, is our nonprofit, the Modern Stone Age Food Lab, and we continue to do a lot of research. We teach a lot of classes for this. So every weekend we're here, we're teaching in-person classes, everything from sourdough bread to cheese making to butchering, all of these things. And we have an online community called the Ancestral Table, and every Monday at noon Eastern time. We do a short half an hour cooking class on some topic. It gets recorded, so you could be there with us then, or it gets recorded and then edited and put up into a library. You can pull it down anytime that you want. And we follow that with a half an hour Q&A, and then we communicate with one another. They have hundreds of people in it now across the country, and it's a great group of people that are doing everything from making cheese to fermenting things and swapping information. We're really excited about this. It's only been going for a few months. You can access all of that, can be found on our website, modernstoneage.com, as well as my book, Eat Like Human, which you can get at a lot of different outlets, but also we sell it online. And if you buy it from us, we'd love to sign it for you and send it out.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for being on here. So I know the whole thing's been about sourdough, but it's been interesting.
And if you want to hear more from Bill also, we also interviewed Bill and his wife, Christina, back in episode 55. And we talked about totally other things at that time, but we love him. We love her. They're great. So you can go check that one out also. So Bill, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. And until next time, stay nourished and stay well.
Thank you so much.